You are watching Punjabi National TV. My name is Gurinder Singh. Today's segment of Beyond the Headlines, we have a special guest, Mr. Nigel Logan. Mr. Nigel Logan is a NDP candidate from Edmonton's Millwood constituency. And welcome, Mr. Nigel.
Sat Sri Akal, thank you for having me.
Thank you. Election, although people or maybe a majority of the Canadian didn't want the election, but it has come now. So what do you want to say?
Well, I mean, on a personal basis, I didn't want the election either. I personally think, and I think a lot of people agree with me, it was irresponsible to call the election. Not just in Alberta, but we're facing a fourth wave with the Delta variant that's breaking through, and it's just not safe. So there's the public health angle, and then there's the political angle, which is that the Jagmeet Singh and the New Democratic Party caucus has committed to supporting the Liberal government through throne speeches and confidence votes because it's important to work together. And I think Canadians want to see a minority government work together. So when we call it an election that nobody wants except the Liberals based on polling numbers, I think there's a little bit of cynicism there.
I see. Well, anyway, now I think everybody is in election mode.
Yeah.
How's your campaign going so far?
You know, it's going very good, I have to say. It's even, as you mentioned, people weren't ready or really wanting an election, but you have to commit. Absolutely. You have to get the message out to people anyways.
Yes.
And there's a strong, what we've seen with COVID and the pandemic response, people are starting to recognize that there's a breakdown, what good leadership is, what good governance looks like. And what we've seen throughout the last 2 years under a provincial government that is not really doing much, to be honest. The federal government, with the aid of the New Democrats, have been actually getting things done. CERB, the wage subsidy, cancelling interest rates on student loans, all kinds of things that the NDP fought for and forced the Liberals to act on. And you know, $2,000 a month on CERB was and keeping people home had a measurable effect on public health. And now that we're seeing it go away, we're seeing the same challenges.
Well, obviously, COVID is there, and it's still there. Even like today in Alberta, we had almost like around 1,500 cases, I heard. Yeah. So apart from COVID, election issues, we talk about affordability, we talk about housing, we talk about healthcare, we talk about issues with the indigenous people. Yeah. So what is the topmost priority for you for this riding?
For this riding, well, it's the same that most Canadians want. It's no matter what religion or culture or language you speak, people want good, affordable homes. They want a good school for their children. They want a safe environment free of racism and discrimination and these kind of things. So it's a mix of issues, and in fact, it's very much a similar campaign. The issues are very much the same as 2 years ago, just being exacerbated by COVID. One example, you mentioned housing, that I'd like to comment on is if you have somebody who's not secure in their home, either they're homeless or maybe they stay with a friend or something like that. If you have to isolate because of exposure to COVID or something like that, where does that person go? It just makes it much more difficult in the reality of for people to face these problems. And so some of the programs that we've offered, CERB, and those are programs we want to look towards the future on, because we know that precarious housing, when people are at risk, they take risky decisions, and then it puts everyone's health at risk, right?
Actually, the reason I'm asking, like issues related to, I would say, this riding, or maybe I would say across Alberta, because if you look at really housing, BC and Ontario are in much worse shape than us, you know. But then there is another issue, the whole Alberta, which is probably, I would say, we are in worse shape than rest of the Canada, than majority of the Canada. It's the employment. Even before COVID, we were struggling. Our economy was struggling. So how do we handle that?
Well, you're exactly right. So this has been raised a lot with me. So you mentioned housing in BC and Toronto, and those people leaving those markets because they can't afford to stay there raise house prices here. But when you don't have a steady employment here in Alberta, the unfortunate thing is as a province, as a people, we've made this big bet on resource extraction, whether it's oil and gas or coal or even lumber. But those are not sustainable. It's the same problem that Canada's always had, where you chop down the trees, you dig up the oil, you send it over the United States border or somewhere else, they process it, raise the price, and then we buy it back.
Absolutely.
And that's been the history of Canada, and right now that's what we're facing in Alberta. So with the New Democratic Party and what I'm proposing for people is something a bit more sustainable. We've talked about, you might have heard the term Green New Deal.
Yes.
Our branding is the New Deal for people. And there's a reason for that, is because people don't necessarily work in oil and gas industry because they enjoy it, but because it pays well. It puts food on the table. And we should never disparage hardworking people. But you can't just leave them high and dry when oil prices are low and the international exports are becoming weaker and weaker by the day. India and China aren't necessarily just going to buy our oil because we want them to. They're rapidly greening their economies into renewable energies. So we need to plan for that. And that means not just renewable energy, although that's certainly part of it, not just wind and solar. There's a lot of transferable skills.
So do you think, sorry to interrupt, do you think that Alberta has enough other options to slowly, or maybe in certain time to slowly get away from oil and gas?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is we still have to heat our homes over the next number of years. We still live in a winter climate. But what I'm talking about is, the proposals we see from the Liberals and Conservatives are always about short-term thinking. We're talking about resource extraction or manufacturing. And those are good, but that's hard. Where's the knowledge economy? I come from an IT background, and many people in here in Mill Woods are from India, where there's an IT hub down in Bangalore.
Absolutely.
There were jobs right here in Edmonton that went to Bangalore even. There's knowledge that we can capture there, and you don't require power plants, you don't require carbon emissions to have a high-tech workforce, a knowledgeable workforce, and attract good jobs.
I lived in, sorry to interrupt you, I lived in Calgary for 10 years, and I have seen that Nortel building, which at one point used to probably employ 20,000 people, and now I think it's a headquarter for Calgary Police. I mean, nobody saw it coming and nobody planned it.
Yeah, and that's, I think we've seen this over the pandemic response, when so many people are working from home. Is real estate something we should be basing our economy on? And there's a huge percentage of Canada's GDP is based on that. We can't necessarily rely. Land doesn't do things, people do things. You can produce things on available land in downtown office towers, but when they're half empty, what do you do with them?
Exactly.
There's been some interesting proposals. I've talked about this in previous campaigns in other contexts, but if you have a couple floors of an office tower, why aren't we incentivizing startups? Why aren't we incentivizing worker-owned companies, making it easier for people to start their own small businesses? And where are the supports for that? We're only looking at supports like oil and gas subsidies are billions. Well, even a small percentage of that would be extremely effective in raising a high-tech sector, for example. And that's on a personal interest and on my own professional background. That's something, if I'm elected as MP, it's something I'd like to put forward. We don't have to be oil and gas based.
Just one more thing related to employment. We have other issues as well. I think back around 2002, from 2002 to 2009, when oil and gas was booming, everything was booming, and there was shortage of skilled, manpower, and companies were allowed to, bring people from outside. Now there's no work. I think probably 50% of the main core engineering, if I talk about electrical, mechanical, civil, or process engineering, those people are looking for jobs, and still companies are sending work overseas.
Yeah.
Do you have that thing in notice?
Yeah, and it's an important issue. I spoke to someone in IBEW 424, which is a local electrical workers association, and something like 70% of their unionized workforce were out of work at the time, and that's still an issue. There's a fellow helping on my campaign. He has a PhD in mechanical engineering, and he drives a bus for City of Edmonton.
Yeah.
Not to disparage bus drivers, but why aren't we taking talent of what people have? I think there's a real danger to sending jobs overseas. And this is, we're always going to have our resource sector, and that's important. And you can't move, a mining project to another country. But we have to be careful about what sort of incentives we give companies that turn around and lay off employees. I'll give you an example. During the COVID pandemic, there was a wage subsidy, and it saved a lot of jobs. But certain telecom companies here in Canada took there's one of them that took $120 million, gave bonuses to their executives, and laid off workers. That money was not meant to be given to executives. It meant to keep people employed. So when a company like that moves a call center overseas or something like that, you're right. That's what happens. We bring people here as, say, a temporary foreign worker. You do all the hard work. You get your permanent residency. You become a citizen, and no job. That's what needs to change.
So this phenomena here, really, what we just what you just mentioned, because there is people, even the common people, they talk about corporate greed. Big, efficient, powerful people, they are manipulating governments. Yeah. Do you think, with the Canada, with the size of the country, and especially with our neighbors, what can we really do?
Right, and that's a difficult question. It's a complicated question. I mean, what the NDP's proposed is essentially what you might call a wealth tax, and part of that is because when you have too much disparity from the people at the top to the bottom, you end up with all kinds of social disorders. And if you have an unbalanced society where people can't find justice or, for that matter, something to eat through conventional or normal means, legal means even, they resort to things. And you see increased crime, you see increased domestic violence, you see drug and alcohol abuse. It affects everybody. And so what we're proposing is not just, okay, we're going to take the money from rich people. No. The money has to go back into our systems that help people in society and prevent those social problems before they arise.
We have to go for a little break, and I think really nice conversation, and we will be back within a few minutes. Welcome back to the show, and our guest today, Mr. Nigel, he is a candidate of NDP party from Edmonton's Millwood constituency. Mr. Nigel, we talked about few issues.
Absolutely.
And Canada, because I came to Canada when I was 35, almost 22 years ago. And without any doubt, without any hesitation, I can say this is the best country in the world. Yeah. And I love this country. But over past few years, although this issue is this issue is very old. Indigenous schools, what happened there, and lately what we found out. And especially countries all over the world where the worst human right record, even they started pointing fingers at Canada. And I guess that made every Canadian felt bad about it. So my question to you is, first, do you think Mr. Trudeau has dealt with this issue the way it should be dealt? And my second question is, had the other party, Conservative Party, had those been in power, or maybe whatever their reaction was to those issues, what is your take on those two issues?
Well, it's a tragic issue. It's all nice and good for people to be patriotic and say Canada's a great country. It is. It's been very welcoming. My wife is from India. She came in 2015, and by all means, it's a much better. It's a great place to live and raise a family.
Absolutely.
But I learned something during that residential school, and if before I talk about Trudeau and the Conservatives, because I don't think it should be about those two. The Liberals and the Conservatives, even the NDP. It should be about the recognition of what Canada as a country did. Because when we comment about other countries covering up genocides or leaders being complicit in genocidal type actions, and there's many international examples. I won't get into that.
So many of them.
But when all of a sudden it's in our own backyard, I think we're also morally culpable. We have to do something about it. I learned on a personal basis when they discovered the 751 graves, unmarked graves, that my own ancestor went through there. She survived, but and I think this is, I want to bring this back to our local conversation about Mill Woods, because there's many languages, cultures, heritages, and religions. And that cut the cord. That cut the cord of tradition. We didn't know about it. People were ashamed to talk about it. I've learned French the last few years, and now I can sort of connect with the experiences of my ancestors. And I think that's important. And I'm not trying to make it about me, because what I'm trying to say is many people who have any sort of Western Canadian heritage probably has a connection to that. And we need to say to ourselves, well, just because it happened so long ago doesn't mean that there isn't still suffering and reparations that need to be made nowadays.
Absolutely.
I just saw in the French language debate last night, they're actually still debating a question whether there should be clean drinking water for Indigenous people.
That's a shame, basically.
And that is a shame, because if you've ever had a chance to visit a reserve in a rural area, it feels like a third world country, and I don't mean that by any exaggeration. Houses are falling apart. The services aren't there. No clean water, and when people are donating food from the food bank, it's nearly expired, or it's all unnutritious food, cakes and things like that. This is a reality that people are living right now. And so I think I can't believe a country as wealthy as Canada, and that has done so many great things internationally for many different countries in war zones and everything, cannot fix its problem in its own backyard. I think that is, everybody is part of that solution.
There's a similar, because ultimately, if you really go deep, and this term is more, people talk about this, and it's world over. It's not only in Canada. You see it everywhere. So racism. So, what do you think? How much racism do we see in our society?
Well, I'm privileged, and I use that word specifically in the sense that I don't face it. But when I'm out with my wife or my children, sometimes we see it. And you just sort of internalize and get used to the reaction, which is unfortunate. But it's systemic. I mean, I sort of noticed it becoming it was always there, but becoming very apparent leading up to the 2015 election when we had the Syrian refugee crisis and things like that. My opponent in this election wrote a bill banning the niqab, where he himself wears visible articles of faith, a turban. I don't see how you can say you're not racist or against racism if you can't put yourself in the shoes of other people that are going to face that. Just a few days ago in Halifax, there was a young taxi driver by the name of Prabjot Singh. He was driving some people home, and four white men slit his throat. And it's a hate crime. I've met many taxi drivers here. My brother-in-law is from Pakistan, and he drove a cab for a little bit. It's dangerous, but people do what they have to do to put food on the table, and they put themselves at risk every day. And when the whole idea of racism starts getting inflamed, and you have figures like Aaron O'Toole that don't really try and tamp it down in their own party, and you have the People's Party of Canada actively blaming things on immigrants, it sets an environment up where something like that can happen. He was a 23-year-old international student coming here for education, perhaps just like yourself, coming here to make a new life for himself, and tragically that was cut short, away from his family and everything. And my thoughts are with him. It's absolutely tragic, but these things happen. These are happening in Edmonton right now. Hijabi women being attacked in broad daylight. And I recently learned that as a proportion, Sikhs face the highest per capita rate of racial abuse. But I would say it's not like Sikhs and Muslims and Indigenous people and black men and women are different. No, we all have to stand together. And like I say, I'm blessed. I don't have to face those issues. I can pass like a white person, and so people don't think about it. But the fact is, it's not up to me to tell you or anyone else how we should react. What we should be doing is supporting and saying, yes, we are going to implement a hate crime commission that's going to look into religious and ethnic-based hate crimes. We're going to collect data from the police when we talk about who gets stopped, who gets arrested at a higher rate. All of those are very important, and without that data, we can't make decisions.
Actually, I think we spent more time on issues like this. I would like to, because we talked about affordability in the previous part of our conversation. Healthcare is I think, because like, especially if we look at south side of the border, and we know that how common people, they have trouble, and it's so difficult. And at least I have experienced in Alberta, like especially governments are trying to somehow, by a backdoor entry or by some other means, they are trying to do things differently. So what are your parties like, how to maintain this system?
The simple answer is more resources and better supports for workers. The Liberals, because this is a political program, the Liberals talk about jurisdiction and why we can't do things like universal pharmacare or dental care. They'll say that's a provincial issue. But the Health Canada Act is a federal act that essentially holds provinces to binding standards in exchange for the funds. And we've said we're going to increase those transfers, but it seems to me that there should be a bit more strict control of that, because, as you mentioned, the backdoor entry of surgeries, or right now,
they're
for
passed
example,
down to the private clinics.
Alberta Health Services right now, while they're pushing nurses out the door by overworking them and exhausting them, they're hiring private nurses for 3 times the wage, ultimately costing us more money. But if you actually sat down and worked with the unions, worked with the workers, the frontline healthcare workers, just like any industry, I think they would tell you what they need in order to do their jobs better. And that part of that comes down to respect and paying them for what their knowledge is, because ultimately, it sounds a bit cheesy, but health is wealth, and you can't have a wealthy society without a healthy society. If people are going without dental work, if people are going without routine medical checkups, like you would see in the private healthcare system, it costs us all more, because that person takes an ambulance and takes up an ER spot, takes up an ICU bed, because they wait instead of getting things checked
Exactly.
out. It's morally superior to help people through a public system, but it's cheaper.
Actually, I have asked this question before to like one of the government, like people who were in power.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, like if we talk about our city, Edmonton, we have University of Alberta,
Yeah.
and I don't know how many doctors are, they do, like they pass their degree every year.
Yeah.
The population is, people are migrating, more people are coming, and like city has grown to, I think, probably 1.3, 1.4 million people.
Yeah.
Why can't we increase the number of, like students, the intake in the university, so that people can have like more affordable and like more doctors, more clinics, and so like
I think it's a great idea. Where Alberta's population doubled in the last 25 years or so.
Absolutely.
And we have the a
number
very similar number of medical doctor space. I don't have the exact figures.
Exactly.
Same with nurses. And so then the solution becomes, well, we have to get nurses and doctors from overseas. So okay, if that's going to be the solution, where's the skills equivalency? How if you're I know someone who was a practicing surgeon in Pakistan, came here, had to train for 3 years under somebody else, but he was never going to qualify to be a surgeon here, right? And so we have to make a better assessment of skills, and this is across all fields, not just medicine, but engineering and IT.
Majority of the professions.
When you apply for a PR and you get your points, and they say, oh, your master's degree is a bachelor's degree, but you're not allowed to practice as that. You have to go do something else. I think like that all ties into me. Where we talk about bringing skilled workers and educated people from other countries, but then what are we offering in return? If you make someone jump through 10 years worth of hoops just to get a job. I know a Filipino woman right now who has a nursing degree. They teach the NCLEX standard, the international standard, and yet she has to pass another exam here to become a nurse. She could be helping right now in our COVID wards,
exactly.
But instead,
exactly.
she's not allowed to work.
Well, hopefully things will change, and and I guess the election day is 20th of this month, right?
Yeah, very soon.
And advanced polling is open.
Starting tomorrow.
Starting tomorrow.
Yep.
Starting tomorrow, and people can go in and vote. And from our side, we can, we encourage people to go and vote, because although nobody wanted this election, but election is there, and we have to select a new government. And Mr. Nigel has, you have heard him, and what we can say is that go and vote. And thank you very much.
Yeah, I want to add to that too, because in my experience, the immigrant population, anyone who's an immigrant, doesn't matter from where, votes at a much lower rate.
Is it?
It's true.
So, that's not a very
so
good thing,
this is something that if we talked before the conversation about young people not voting and they don't get their voices heard, the same thing has to happen. Do vote. I would prefer you vote for me, but it's important that you get your voice out there and voice heard, because if they're not working for your vote, if I'm not working for your vote, how can you're not going to see the things you want in Parliament.
Absolutely. We talked about all the good things, and if we know the good things, and the only way to make the change is to raise your voice, and that's you can do that by voting for the right people, right party, right person. And with this, we end our show here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sat Sri Akal.
Sat Sri Akal.